So good morning and welcome everyone to our session on short-term and executive compensation. My name is Anna Albuquerque. I am one of the faculty advisors. The other faculty advisors are Rodrigo Canales, who is sitting here from Management Organization, and Charles Stark from a former professor of the practice in Management Organization, also the chair of a center on executive compensation, besides having done many other things, sitting on boards, and many other things that Charles is doing. Then we have the students are Joseph Gionki, Paige Polinsky, Jackson Palmer, and Mackenzie Dunson, and they are going to present to you their findings of their research on short-termism and executive compensation. And finally, so we'll do that for 10 minutes, and then we have our distinguished panelists that will share with us many insights from their practice as well as their research. And those are again Charles Stark and Jevon Eagle, which is from professor of the practice in strategy and innovation. And so they have together worked for many companies, McKinsey, Staples, PepsiCo, let me see, my PepsiCo, GE, Bristol Myers, and many others. And so they will have lots of insights to share about how is it that corporations try to solve this problem of, nowadays with the fast-paced environment in which we lived in, executives have pressures to deliver short-term performances, but if executive pay ties their compensation to the meeting those short-term incentives, then they might undermine long-term investments that impact the value of companies. So they will share those insights with us. So the floor is yours, and please take it away.
Thank you. Different presentation. Structures and how that impacts companies' view on short-termism versus long-term gains. My name is Steve. And I'm Mackenzie. Yeah. And then I've talked about the faculty advisors. To kind of give an overview, we're going to kind of do an introduction, introduce the problem of short-termism, and maybe discuss about it. And then we're going to go into different types of structures, a little bit of background on the literature, the research that's done already, and then we're going to talk about some case studies, and then articulate some applications of executive compensation.
So to reintroduce the idea of short-termism in terms of executive compensation, a tendency for executives to prioritize immediate financial results for personal gain over long-term strategic growth. Research on the surface level shows that this could be tied to compensation structures with stock price and quarterly earnings targets that encourages this behavior. And early models show that executives prefer short-term projects in fear of early termination. And then there's other topics that show that and argue that short-term compensation can be beneficial in certain contexts. But for us today, it's important to ask the question, are compensation structures to blame for short-termism? And if so, how can we design them to incentivize long-term value creation? So let's start by looking at different types of compensation structures, starting with the most basic being fixed pay, your base salary, providing stable, guaranteed annual income. Variable pay combines this with bonuses tied to short-term metrics, including quarterly profits, revenues, performance. Also, stock options, which reward executives for boosting their stock price, as well as restricted stock, which is your long-term incentive. So over recent decades, there's been a shift from salary and bonus-based packages towards equity-based pay with the desire to align executive incentives with shareholder interests. And while this does promote ownership and responsibility, it can also encourage short-sighted decision-making over long-term R&D, innovation, or CSR investments that can potentially reduce current performance metrics. So the bottom line here is that the structure of executive compensation plays a role not only in pay, but also in shaping decision making. So just to demonstrate this shift towards equity-based pay, we have a diagram here that shows the average compensation for CEOs in the largest 50 firms across the 1900s. So starting in the early 1900s, you could see that it was almost entirely salary and bonus based. And then moving towards the early 2000s, you have a huge rise in options and long-term incentive plans based on stock. So less than half of CEO compensation was coming from their salary and current bonus, and then the majority coming from stock and performances. So one of the important things to think about with this shift toward equity-based pay is agency theory, which describes the relationship between corporate executives as agents and shareholders as principals. One of these agency conflicts to consider is information asymmetry, in which executives possess more timely and detailed knowledge of the firm's operations than its shareholders. And this could lead to moral hazard, which is where executives may take actions to benefit themselves and their short-term compensation plans and boost short-term results, exposing the firm to unnecessary long-term risk. So why does this matter? As we stated, poorly designed pay structures can exacerbate agency costs and lead to value-destructive decisions. Now that we have a background and we're a little bit familiar with what short-termism is, the different compensation structures and the conflicts that can arise, we decided to look into different literature and some case studies of different companies today to assess different compensation structures and how we can maybe mitigate the problem of short-termism in executive compensation.
Yeah. And as you probably have heard from other discussions, that there's not a clear conclusion whether short-termism is really all bad or if it's outsides just kind of following short-term policies. So we want to talk a little bit about the research that's been done on short-termism specifically with compensation. So obviously there's an argument against short-term. That's kind of why we're here today. Some research has shown that long-term compensation actually boosts long-term growth in companies instead of just short-term. They've also found that short-term compensation policies also to CEOs using those policies to kind of boost earnings to get more money from that interaction. So they'll purposely boost up stock prices so they just left in on that money to benefit that really improve growth for the company. And oftentimes those are CEOs who are insecure, so CEOs who are either new or aren't very like persuasive on the company. They've also found that managers are just generally more likely to partake in behavior if their compensation is.
And there are a couple of other contrasting literatures. So, for example, is the one that's first listed up here. It kind of shows that there are different dynamic models that allow firms to capture growth in both the short term and in the long term. And an additional study by Thacker kind of shows that with short-termism, there are decreased information rents that could occur. So basically, like, there's less of a risk that like a manager is holding back information in the short term, and when it's focused on the short term.
So what does this research suggest firms do? Obviously, it depends whether you wholeheartedly believe that long-term is the best option versus whether you have a mix of both short-term and long-term compensation. That's your factor. Long-term compensation, wholeheartedly believe it's compensation package. Research on boards that just barely have long-term compensation packages versus those that just barely voted against putting them in place, and found that the firms that put in long-term compensation packages actually have larger returns in the long run. Long-term compensation packages, you kind of want to use stock option or performance metrics that are directly linked to your company's long-term goals. So obviously that's very specific and what their goals are in the long term, but you implement those into your executive packages to kind of align everyone on the same mission. And then Jeff also suggested that these long-term metrics kind of mitigate the risk of managers inflating earnings. So it kind of keeps the executives honest with the actual earnings of the company, and kind of links the performance to the actual.
Right, and then in terms of both short-term compensation, research suggests that stock prices may actually be helpful for a long-term focus. And firm earnings that are tied to executive compensation can promote short-term focus. In particular, firm earnings that are tied to quarterly focus can help to basically increase profits in the short term. That can also help to sustain long-term in a company's value that allows them to make investments. In addition to that, they also find that corporate compensation should be tied to the time horizon that the company is focusing on. And things like performance metrics like stock options kind of have varying results whether or not it's an effective metric at reducing short-termism. For an example, a study by Martin et al. Kind of explains that while stock options might be effective, when tied with other things like outside pressure from like a board of directors, it can tend to kind of push towards short-termism instead.
To supplement our research, we looked at 5 case studies across 5 various industries. So to start off, we looked at Exxon and Pepsi, 2 companies that are in primarily, I'd say negative externality industries, industry as well as a company goes with soda and other negative health outcomes. So these 2 companies, interestingly, have some pretty progressive pay structures. So with Exxon, you have you're balancing short-term with long-term outlooks. But what's cool with Exxon is that they're tying their executive pay with reducing carbon emissions and also investing in a low carbon future. So while it is an oil industry, they are tying that CEO CC pay with a more sustainable future. So we found that this hybrid reduces short-term pressure as well as rewarding outcomes there. And with Pepsi, they also have a pretty balanced pay structure, so they want to support that long-term vision with that short-term performance for shareholders. So what's interesting with Pepsi is they have pay tied with healthier product lines. So instead of looking at, a full sugar Pepsi, it might have a diet Pepsi or even juice of some sort. The vesting period is 3 to 5 years to ensure accountability. Project can reach its full fruition, and we have found that this could encourage growth without sacrificing current benchmarks. So the next 3 industries are 3 companies found across 3 very distinct industries. So with MetLife, you have a long feedback industry since it is primarily a life insurance company. It focuses on the financial stability, not just those earnings reports in the quarterlies. Some key metrics are ROE, capital strength, and they also have clawbacks to protect against reckless risk taking. One concern we have with MetLife is metrics which could be easy to manipulate. Some issues there. With Meta, it's a bit concerning their current pay structure is dominated by equity compensation. So this ties executive wealth to those shareholder outcomes. So some key issues with this would be there's few transparent metrics tied to like innovation. So like they are trying to do that metaverse and AI, but it's not, their pay is not tied to that. And we found that a reliance on stock price alone could misguide the executive stuff. Illinois Toolworks, it's an interesting executive setup up there that's decentralized with 80 autonomous business units. So this is a very unique company structure. So they do focus on after-tax ROIC. Many investors are looking at value, as well as they're not incorporating invested equities. So that is something that a lot of against that short-term focus, but to balance this out, they do want to reinforce that long-term accountability through stock ownership and clawback policy. Some key concerns we have here would be a heavy reliance on certain financial targets, which could underemphasize their long-term vision with ESG. In wrapping it up, we found that executive pay is a key driver of corporate decision-making. If you design it poorly, it's your pressure for that short-term outlook, but if you design it with you'll have accountability and sustainable returns. One thing that our group has noticed is that we do believe there's more research needed as these practices evolve, pay structures evolve very much so in the previous decade. So as this continues to evolve, firms must consider the context, the trade-offs, and the performance balance of pay structures. So thank you for your attention, and we'd love to start with the panel.
guess that's you.
Any hard questions are coming to you.
Probably. We're ready.
All right, thank you for joining us today. We'd love for you to introduce yourself to the audience and talk about your background.
Go ahead, Jeff. Want to go first? Hi, everybody. I'm Jevin Eagle. I have three different hats professionally right now. So one of my hats is I'm the CEO of Boston University Hillel, which is the Center for Jewish Life here. We're a nonprofit. We have a bunch of employees and resources. That's one thing. The other is I'm a professor of the practice here, strategy and innovation. Rodrigo's my dear partner in that. And I've taught SM 131. I've also taught SR 801, social impact. And I've done research on building the social impact consortium has anywhere between 40 and 60 people, companies, executives who gather together to talk about social impact issues. And the third thing is I'm a director of Carter's, the world's largest children's clothing company. And I've been on the compensation committee for 15 years. And I chair the compensation human capital committee. So I can talk to you actually about setting compensation because that's what I do. We just, by the way, Carter's had our CEO of 17 years retire. We just hired a new CEO who was the president of Vans before. And we had to come up with a whole compensation package for him. One of the things we did at Carter's when we were trying to answer questions of how to get better at compensation was call on Charlie to give us his wisdom, which was great.
So I'm Charlie Tharp, and until December 31st, I was a professor here in the management and organization, taught executive compensation, corporate governance, and strategic human resources. Prior to that, I was on the faculty at Cornell and prior to that, Rutgers. But I spent most of my career in industry. And I hate to say it, but in 1977, I wrote my doctoral thesis on executive compensation. So I've been doing it for over 4 decades and studied it in law school. So I've been deep in exec comp for a long time, but it's really fun working with boards and compensation committees. And in 2008, a colleague and I founded the Center for Executive Compensation in Washington, DC. It's got about 160 companies that subscribe, so to speak. They're members of our center, and we do testimony and congressional testimony, meeting with the SEC, doing board education, and writing white papers on various topics. So it's really fun. If you ever want to go and have a wonderful career, go into executive compensation.
Carter's is one of your members.
They are a very great members. So yeah, it's a fun thing to do. We have GE, Pepsi, a lot of big companies, but we have across all industries, and the variety is what makes it interesting because they have very different approaches that we're going to talk about.
So this next question is directed at Charlie. What does short-termism mean to you, and why is it important that we keep an eye out for it in business scenarios?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting. When I was preparing for this, one of my colleagues said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "We're going to talk about short-termism as opposed to long-term." And he said, "Help me understand something. Isn't the long-term just the summation of the short-term?" I said, "Oh, I guess you're right. So long-term over 3 years is 3 annuals. You kind of figure where they're going." So in one level, they're no different because the decisions you make in the short term, hopefully for most companies, are going to have an enduring impact, and they set the basis for future targets, for future performance, their investment decisions, capital allocation, all the things that determine the trajectory as you go forward. So in a way, it's a false duality in a sense, but at the same time, certain industries, and I spent 15 years heading HR in Bristol Myers Squibb, a pharmaceutical company. I mean, there you're spending $3 billion a year, and it takes about 7 years to get a drug to market. And you hope the 3rd year out, it has sales of over $3 billion. If you develop it in-house, it has a gross margin of 90% falling to the bottom line. Their long-term decisions are really important because you're committing huge amount of money. Carter's, I was at Saks Fifth Avenue. You know, we talked about a spring buy and a fall buy in terms of the fashion season. A very different concept. Their short term really determined the business, and our home metrics were same store sales and gross margin, very short term measures. not return on invested capital going out over some horizon, investment horizon. So for me, short-term is sort of a buzz phrase that out of context doesn't have much meaning. If you look at companies and the decisions that are contingent upon sustained performance, often those are short-term decisions that have a long tail, but hopefully informed by some sort of long-term view as to where the company's going. So short-term for me is a bit problematic, and we're going to talk about the mix of pay, which your research did. By the way, of those 5 companies you show, 4 of them are my clients, and so if there's anything wrong with them, I own it.
It's
But
your fault.
we're going to talk about the mix of pay and maybe how it addresses that issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Quick follow-up question, Therapy. What do you think drives short-termism?
I think short-termism, every year companies have to set capital budgets. Every year has to decide the allocation of that capital, and that's a short-term decision. You do it each year. But there's also pressures from investors. You know, we used to have a joke at Bristol Myers Squibb, if we missed our quarterly earnings, what the street expected, the investors, by a penny, it took 30 billion off our market capitalization. The value of the company was almost $200 million company in terms of the value of the stock out there. So if you disappointed quarterly the expectations, it had a big short-term impact on the stock price and investors. So short-termism often is due to the legal requirement that a public company has to report financials every 13 weeks. It's something you have to do. And so there's this push and pull. And ironically, a lot of the investors say they're long-term investors, but they focus an awful lot on what you do every 13 weeks.
Thank you. All right, our next question is focused on you, Jevin. I pronounced that perfect.
Perfect.
All right, our conference is focused on the challenges of ensuring that management is not overly focused on short-term results at the expense of long-term sustained value creation. So if so, what is the role of board in helping to mitigate short-termism, and what role does the design of executive compensation play in encouraging management to focus on long-term performance?
So it's funny, as I heard the topic and then as I listened today, there was a little bit of dissonance for me. Because to me, there's 2 separate issues. One is and by the way, there's public companies and private companies are very different. And a lot of these themes are more alive for public companies than private companies because of the requirements to report. So we could have a whole conversation around impact of corporate structure and whether or not you're public or private on that. I think there's 2 separate issues. One is there short-termism in compensation? The other is there short-termism in how public companies are managed and run? On the first one, it's not resonating a lot with me, and I can share examples along the way, but I don't see our compensation, narrowly defined as compensation, really driving that. I actually think it drives long-termism, our compensation system, at least for Carter's and our peer group, which I study carefully. Do I think public companies, due to the 13-week reporting and the desire to survive and not be fired, have a lot of pressures for short-term? Absolutely, hugely. You're constantly, and I worked for Staples, which was a public company, and was responsible for all the merchandising, and every quarter we were focused on it, and certainly Carter's is, and probably every one of your clients is worried. And if you have a pattern of never missing and then you miss, you could lose 10-20% of your whole market value. So there are a lot of factors that drive short-term thinking, but in my opinion, one of them isn't compensation, actually, in particular.
No, really good point to separate behavior from the structure. Because there's reputational harm to executives. There's potential of being fired. And guess what? There's not a big market for fired CEOs. Okay. You don't want to be in the Wall Street Journal. We just hired the CEO that another company fired. It's a high casino. If you get fired, it's not good. But the structure of compensation, on average, a CEO in the S&P 500, 70 to 80% of their pay is long-term. The annual incentive is about 15 to 20%, and base salary is usually 10% or less. So the structure of compensation encourages one thing, but the reputation and risk personally maybe has a different pull. So, Jevin, I hadn't heard anybody articulate it quite that clearly. There's differences between short-termism in behavior and personal risk versus the short-termism as it relates to the structure of compensation. Very different.
And by the way, the data that you quoted, which you of course know better than I do, the upside
Yeah.
for an executive is
It's
even
long-term.
more long. You were saying 70% of the compensation, the annual
Yeah.
compensation. That's as it's delivered to the executive. But since they have to hold a lot of that equity, and since a lot of that equity is tied to future performance, it could be 95 to 98% of their upside
Easily. Yeah.
is the long-term stock price performance of the company,
Yeah.
which is the opposite of short-termism.
Yeah. And if I can go a little off script here, the other thing is the personal ownership of stock by executives. I'll give you an example. Exxon was a company up there. Their CEO owns 86 times his salary in personal owning of stock. And his salary is $2 million. 86 times 2 million is his personal ownership of Exxon stock. Now, he's been with the company about 32 years, and you go through all that. Executives are required to own CEO 7 times salary on average of personal ownership, which is about $10 million, non-diversifiable. They can't sell it. When I was an executive at Bristol Myers Squibb, my wife, who's a CPA accountant, would say, I can't believe how much risk you have in that. 90% of our personal wealth was in Bristol Myers Squibb between pension, current compensation, and stock ownership. So to think of short-termism, you hit the nail on the head right at the beginning. It's about image and reputation as a good manager, not risking getting fired. But the compensatory element of it is pretty trivial on a short term.
Kevin, there was a question I think is
Yeah.
would be good for you to tackle, which is the role of boards in that equation.
Yeah,
So when it comes to compensation, let me answer the narrow and the broader one.
yeah, we didn't answer the question.
Yeah, thank you, keep me honest, and you should too. So on the narrow question of boards with compensation, the boards set the compensation of public companies for the executive team. So the executives can request, they can have input, they certainly sit in meetings with us, but it's our decision. But the way we set them is based on the market and with consultants and outside groups that pressure us to perform a certain way according to the market. So we can get into that. What role do boards have on the broader question of short-termism and long-termism and culture and quarterly earnings? At least in my Carter's experience, and I honestly didn't spend enough time with Staples board to really know what they did. But at Carter's, we have a lot of influence. We are engaged with and set strategy. We recruit and hire the CEO. We have a significant say in other people. And then the Compensation and Human Capital Committee, our committee, is deeply engaged in the development plans and coaching of the executive team. So I would say we have actually a lot of influence over that. In my experience with Carter's, the board is more focused on the long term than management because missing the quarterly earnings is more painful. It's painful for everyone, but it's more painful for management than it is for a board. Did that answer it? Yeah.
All right, next question. We'll start with Charlie again. So based on the research review we've conducted, it seems that the literature is unclear as to the effects executive compensation has on short-term behavior. Based on your experience, do you think executive compensation can affect short-termism, and how? Why do you think there are discrepancies in the literature surrounding this?
Yeah, so first I'll address the literature. The literature is a bit captive of the available data. And stick with me for a second. So you read in the newspaper, an executive made 15 or 20 million dollars. I guarantee you they did not make that. Maybe they made more, maybe they made less. But what's disclosed in the annual required report is called a proxy statement. And that's what shareholders vote on, and it's the information that people have to look. It is not real money. It is the accounting expense to the company of the potential earnings they can get over 3 years, 5 years. And it's all under the accounting rules. Why? So that you can compare pay in one company to another. So it's a standardized way of reporting it. And a very small portion of it's real money, usually the salary and annual bonus. About 80% of it is hypothetical pay that might be earned out in the future. Or if it's a stock option, there's a methodology called Black-Scholes from Myron Scholes and Fisher Black. They won a Nobel Prize on this mathematical estimate of what a stock option might be worth based on volatility, some other things. So I think part of it is the available data is very difficult to compare. And if you compare hypothetical future pay to actual past performance, often you don't get a robust sort of correlation. So research, they're not doing bad research. It's just a fact of what data is available and how it's done. But I think compensation can have an impact on short-termism that has to be guarded, and I'll tell you why. My research and my work with companies is that executives respond more to annual payments than long-term. So think about this. I'm going to get out in the future $3 million 3 to 5 years from now. Or I'm going to get $700,000 in March after we close the books. What do you buy your boat with? What do you pay your kids' tuition with? And you just saw what happened in the stock market lately. The certainty equivalent of current cash is very important. It's fungible, it's immediate, and it's certain. You know what it is. And by the way, what an executive does more directly impacts it, because there are usually in operational measures like operating income, gross margin. So it's not surprising it would have that effect. And below the CEO, it's a much bigger portion of managerial pay. So yeah, it can have an impact on short-termism, but that's where the board comes in. And as Jevin, I'm sure is painfully aware, I always tell boards, remember, when you're on a board, you're renting your reputation to that company. Think about that. I go on a board, and if they get a bad vote on pay, if they cook the books, if there's all sorts of, you know who? They're going to look at the board and say, aren't you doing your job? And a lot of board members are CEOs of other companies. Would you want your CEO on a board where they thought they were doing a bad job and shareholders voted against them? So there is a reputational investment that you have, as all board members do, which helps to drive a little more of this long-term and more robust oversight of pay.
Awesome, thank you. So question is, do you think in certain instances, short-term compensation structures are beneficial? If so, which instances and why?
It's you, Jevin, given the industry you're in.
Well, I struggle with answering your question because I'm not sure. We haven't considered short-term, I would say a short-term compensation system would be one that says the majority of your compensation will be based on how you do this year.
Yeah. No.
We have not had that. I have not experienced that when I was an executive at Staples. I didn't experience that. And I haven't experienced that at Carter's. There are certain, so on the one hand, I would say it's hard for me to relate to that question. That being said, there are other factors that go into compensation that I mentioned earlier and Charlie summarized that could drive short-termism. And some of those factors intersect with executive pay. So for example, at Carter's, and this is typical of our peer group of 15 companies, which are the largest, the core apparel, a lot of the core apparel companies. Order of magnitude, 60 to 70% of the pay is long-term equity-based, 60 to 70%. If the triggering of that pay is based on annual earnings per share numbers, then that could drive short-term behavior, even though if you were just focused on how much money you were going to make, a rational executive would focus on the long term. But not everyone is rational. Charlie was mentioning, would you rather have $700,000 today or $3 million in 3 years? Raise your hand if you'd rather have 700,000 today than 3 million in 3 years. If you were rational, if the 3 million was certain,
That's different.
or 3 million was very, very likely, most of us, if we were asked, answering the question the way I framed it, would pick the 3 million. Because we don't have that much inflation, right?
Yeah.
If you said, would you rather have 700,000 today or a possibility of 3 million that might really not happen, then we would all start just trying to assess how likely is that 3 million and how important is the 700,000 right now to our lifestyle. So, but that being said, even with short-term targets to trigger equity, the equity has to be held for multiple years. And the upside is driving the long-term stock price, logically, clearly. That being said, there's a lot of pressure to hit quarterly numbers. There's an outsized amount of pressure on an annual bonus, even though it's not a high percentage of your compensation. By the way, why might that be? I'm just curious. If your bonus is 20% of your total comp, why would you care a lot about your bonus? One reason is it's short term, but why else? It's sure, it's short term. Also, it turns out that bonuses are a higher percentage of compensation for more junior people, not just for executives. And you're trying to motivate the company. So there are a lot of reasons why you still might be short-term focused, even though the compensation logically doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
Awesome. Moving on to the next question here. Direct this one at you, Charlie. What are the potential downsides of using executive compensation to help mitigate concerns over the risk of management adopting a short-term performance?
What are the risks of short-term?
The risks of adopting a short-term approach.
Yeah, so just to finish the thought on short-term, where I think Jevin was spot on. Where it could be beneficial is if you stop for a second and not think about compensation just as incentives. Think about compensation as a form of communication. So I want you to increase diversity in our workforce. So when you're hiring people, I want to make sure that you have a diverse slate and that you pay attention to really looking for talent in all segments of the available workforce. If I put some money on that, that's like an exclamation point at the end of the sentence. I want more diversity. And you say, okay, now I say, I want more diversity and 10% of your annual bonuses on it. You pay a little more attention. So back to thematic leadership, if you're a leader and you want to emphasize something, hanging a little pay on it is a form of the seriousness to which you approach it. So there it can have an advantage. The disadvantage is if the actions to achieve short-term performance are really at the expense of long-term. As an example, I mentioned before, we spend $3 billion a year in pharmaceuticals on research. I think Pfizer spends $5 billion a year. It's very and that's an expense. It's not capitalized. It's an annual operating expense for pharmaceutical companies, not a capital investment. If I just take a little, not do that clinical trial this year, save $300 million. If I'm on after-tax earnings as my incentive, I just gave myself a raise. Or if it's short-term earnings per share, I just convinced the company to buy back more shares. Earnings divided by number of shares is called earnings per share. And what's powerful? Change in the denominator. The ratio goes. So there are things that can make short-term problematic, but that's why you have a board. The board is going to look at that and say, no, we're going to use average shares outstanding during the year. We're going to use the budgeted share with reallocation to buybacks, because we're not going to let you get a raise by doing something like that. So transparency, governance, and Jevin and people like him running their reputation to a company.
Thank you. All right, Jevin, what kind of management compensation strategies do you think work best to promote that long-term thinking over the short term? So for example, how does the committee think about incentive metrics as reinforcing longer term on value creation? Which metrics do you personally use for annual incentives and which metrics for long-term incentives?
So, good question. So a lot of companies focus on sales and earnings. By the way, and management loves earnings per share, generally speaking, more than operating earnings, because they can play around with the denominator. Because they're really the same, other than the denominator, which is the number of shares. The number of shares is about how much cash you use to buy your shares. It's not about your operating performance. So management loves earnings per share. When I was management, I loved that. A board member, most board members I know would prefer operating earnings to actually compensate based on the operating performance of the business. There's arguments management uses for earnings per share, and I'm happy to share that with you, but generally speaking, management prefers that. So if we want to put more incentive on future investments, there's still a lot of incentive on the future because you're getting stock that if it performs well, and it will only perform well if you make good long-term, there's still a lot of upside to sales and earnings per share. But if you want to put even more emphasis on the long term, there are a few options. Carter's has used these, by the way. So one of them is to tie some of your compensation to stock price performance over the long term. Relative stock price performance. And if it's over a long enough period of time, I think that's as long-term as it gets. The other thing that you can do is you can have an element of your compensation metrics that are tied to strategic initiatives that are by definition long-term. And a lot of companies have that in their structure. Carter's does. In our most recent proxy, I think it was, I don't remember exactly, but I think it was 20% of our compensation was tied to strategic initiatives. Those can be really long-term focused. For example, it could be, are you doing research and development that's identifying long-term possibilities, or was it it was Pepsi that was up there? Are you developing innovative products that aren't bad for your health? Things like that. So those could be metrics. They also could be metrics tied to social impact.
Right.
I think there'll be less of those now than there were a few years ago, but there still could be. And that could be diversity, equity, inclusion. It could be how you market to disadvantaged minorities, which markets you go into. So there was a lot of conversations that we have as a board on that. All public company boards that I know of employ compensation consultants. Do you know any that don't?
Only one, and that's because the head in-house used to be a consultant, but you're right. And it's almost an optic. If you don't, it looks like you're not being thoughtful. Yeah.
It's really risky to not have, it's so risky to not have one that everyone has one. So why would you have a consultant? Because the consultant can tell you what the market practices are and what the best practices are. And since you're putting your reputation for rent, if you can prove that you are using an outside consultant to help make sure that you're doing something that's in line with the market, it's pretty darn hard to accuse you then of doing something wrong.
Yeah.
So the consultants bring a lot of information to us. The challenge is if you are an outside person looking in at the whole system and wanting the system to be different, there's a lot of forces at work that make it hard to make the system different.
Yeah.
I did call up Charlie though and said to Charlie a few years ago, I'm not sure we have to be like everyone else, because if we could come up with something better, we'd be willing to discuss that. Charlie, what ideas do you have for us?
Mhm.
You remember this?
I do.
That we could do different than what the typical company does, that would better align our compensation with our long-term performance. That was basically the question.
Yeah.
And we ended with Charlie saying, actually, you're doing pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a homogenization, and for board members, it's safe. I just did what everybody else does, what the consultant told me to do. There's a movement now to do more tailoring. In fact, I just had a webinar where I had a professor from Virginia Tech who did some research. It's called the one size fits all, the Me Tooism. And he found actually, as Willis Towers Watson, one of the big consulting, companies that don't adopt the standard approach outperform over time. They tend to have more stock options. They tend to have longer periods to earn that stock. And so there's a lot of factors. And so I just had a webinar, it was attended by about 150 people. It was very popular. And we're doing some more research on that. But when it comes back to metrics, you know, boards make 3 decisions. This is very simple. I hate to say it, but your job's really simple.
I wish I believed that.
It's pay versus whom. What's the market? Who are you comparing to? Other large apparel companies, public. What's the form of pay you're going to get? How much short-term, how much long-term, how much performance-based, how much just stock-based? And the hardest decision for boards is pay for what? What is the right performance metric to earn that? What's the target that's enough stretch? What do you have to do to get double the award or to get something to cut in? And I always tell boards you want to do 2 things. What are the measures in your business that reflect the level of performance? Revenue, profit. Profit's a level of performance because you could destroy value with a lot of profit. You're not meeting your average cost of capital. And then the second one is what's the quality of performance? It's usually a return measure. It's a longer term gross margin type measure. So you always want measures that reflect the level of performance and the quality of performance. And that's where boards really spend a lot of time thinking about what are the right metrics.
And like everything else we teach here at Questrom, the ideal is to have alignment between the strategy that the company has, the structure that the company has, and the culture that the company has.
Simply put.
So the goal is not how do I sit in a corner and just randomly think about compensation. The goal is how do I align compensation with how we're really trying to run and build this company.
Yeah.
That's our question.
Yeah.
And by the way, the compensation consultants I've worked with, and one could be a skeptic, I'm actually generally not on this topic. They have always said to me, if you have a good business reason to do something different than the market, that's a very good reason to do something different than the market. I've never heard them say you have a really critical reason to do something different and you should still not do it.
Yeah.
Because it'll make you look bad. I've never heard them say that.
And as a fiduciary, which you are, you're a fiduciary of the shareholders. You represent them. If you think it's better and you don't do it,
Yeah, for
you've
sure.
probably violated your fiduciary duty. It's
Yeah.
called the duty of loyalty. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, by the way, just one point. All of you in your jobs, when you graduate, you get those big jobs, make a lot of money because you're coming out of here. And you're managing people. Whoever you hire, you're going to have to make 3 decisions. You know what those decisions are? What's the market? How much do I have to pay? How am I going to pay them? Do they get overtime? They get a bonus? They get benefits? And what am I going to pay them to do? It's the same decisions for anybody in any job that you're making for executives.
Yeah.
I want to be competitive. I want to have performance-based pay, and I get to decide what performance is. Any job that you get, the same 3 decisions. So that kind of demystifies executive pay. It's the same thing.
So can I share one thing? And it's not really on your question list, but this is a real big issue, particularly now with these markets. Okay, so if you're an executive and you want to go work at a company, you have an expectation of what you want to get paid. And the expectation is your bonus at 100% target and your equity at what basically Black-Scholes would value it at. What happens if you're working in a company that has structural reasons why it's not going to be able to achieve those objectives? So now you're the compensation committee of the board. You want to be able to attract talent and keep them and not have them leave. But the company's not performing well enough to pay them what they would normally make. What do you do? By the way, that's going to be almost every company in America this year.
Yeah.
Probably. So what do you do? That's a real question. That's to me a more alive question at the moment than short-term.
Yeah. And there's a simple answer, but we don't have time for it.
Yes. of time, so maybe we'll just open for a couple of questions and because we don't have a lot of time, but thank you so much for such an engaging discussion.
Good question.
It
That's
is
a
great.
quick question. And I'd love your reaction to that. So kind of like a quick observation and a question. So the quick observation is, I found it kind of like super interesting when both of you were saying like, well, actually compensation to me doesn't really fit into the short-termism, et cetera. But then you both described how every company basically has integrated this very long-term view of compensation. And so to me, it's kind of like, actually, you remember that graph of what compensation used to look like a few years ago, which was actually just salary and bonus
Right.
for yearly performance. I think the fact that to both of you, it's like, it's not even a question anymore. It's a huge percentage of your compensation is gonna be long-term, shows that we've institutionalized that it really matters to have a long-term view in compensation.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really testament to that, that to you, Jevin, it's like, it's not even a question to me anymore. It's right, because it's been so baked into how we think about this. And so I think it's kind of interesting
Yeah.
that it's almost like the opposite. It's like, it's no longer a question because we've all agreed that it super duper matters. It's 80%, 75%, 90% of an executive compensation.
Yeah.
Question, you're all both talking about alignment and the importance of alignment. I would argue that, you know, you talked about strategy and structure and culture, and I would put values on top of strategy, right? Like the importance of having clear values as a company that then are aligned with your strategy, with your culture, et cetera.
Yeah.
And the question is, we've talked a lot about performance issues, and if you invest in research and development for future performance, et cetera, what if any role do other kinds of stakeholders play? What I mean by that is, for example, why should Pepsi care about having healthier options if they could continue performing super well by selling non-healthy options? Why should Exxon care about if they could continue performing well? Like, is there like, what role do these external constituencies and potentially bad outcomes for others that don't really affect my performance directly? Like, what's the role of that in the equation?
Yeah, so one thing I hear from companies is, you know, the next generation of employees we want, they want us to care about the environment. And I used to work at Pepsi, by the way, and we made bubble water and salty snacks, made a fortune off it. That's not what people are focusing on these days. It's inconsistent with the lifestyle most people want, the health. So if I'm going to attract these graduates when they come out, you know, I can't be a tobacco company, I can't be a big polluter, and I can't make just greasy things that clog up your arteries, right? So question is, how do I balance that? Versus Frito-Lay is a cash cow within Pepsi, having worked, it is a cash cow. You people would suck down those Doritos like crazy, right? And you can always tell when they have the yellow fingers. I mean, but anyways, you know, there is a profit trade-off. And that's the balance that boards and companies have to do, is how they manage that to appeal to people, different investors, regulators who are going to come in and say, you know, your business, there's a real health risk. You're gonna have to put a warning label on that package of products that you're selling. Yeah. I don't know, if you have a different perspective.
No, I mean, there's a lot of pressures from stakeholders when you're a public company. And there's a certain amount of pain you take, there's a certain amount of logic that comes with them. They have certain stakeholders have the ability to influence. So there are a lot of pressures that do work their way into the business. And still the biggest impact is when you can tie issues stakeholders have with the value creation model for the company. That's when there's the most upside of the stakeholders' pressure coming in. And part of the things stakeholders should try and do then is try and help you see how you can tie it into your core strategic priorities for the company.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful discussion. So much one could continue talking about. I think we are tied with time, so I'd like to thank our